So first, I'm going to try to describe what I think the essence of Twin Peaks really is in very general terms without getting into any spoilers, any specifics. So if you want to understand Twin Peaks, you got to start with the main protagonist, Dale Cooper. Big city detective, goes to the small town to investigate a murder. Now, Dale is a character you've never seen before. You can't tell whether he's from some bygone, long-lost era, a simpler, better time, or some future utopia we've yet to experience. He's this mix of childlike joy and exuberance and energy in the simplest pleasures of life, a cup of coffee, a slice of pie, and then also the spiritual side and this interest in Eastern philosophy, dream interpretation, and in this great reversal of evil big city people come and corrupt a sweet small town, he, as just this beacon of light and goodness, comes to this small town where we meet all these quirky, eccentric characters that are very memorable and you fall in love with, that are also all linked up in all these interlocking ways, and suddenly you have a town of all these characters and they're all linked up in different ways, and it becomes very soap opera-like. And this soap opera element was a huge part of Twin Peaks Season 1 and 2. This over-the-top melodrama and emotion and backstabbing and cheating and infidelity and business, insurance scams, just this over-the-top soap opera that at times it felt like it was parodying it and making fun of it. At times it seemed like it was just embracing it. And these are the ingredients that made up Twin Peaks. We had this over-the-top soap opera melodrama that was often mixed with seedy, underworld criminal, basic human evil. Then we also had supernatural, unexplainable, otherworldly, real evil and darkness. This is where the horror aspect comes into play. Then we had the absurdism, where things would happen on the show that made no kind of logical sense, and it was funny, and this was part of its humor, just this insane, off-the-wall, situational humor. And then also there was slapstick humor, and this is probably most people's least favorite part of Twin Peaks, but something that was always there, this kind of Three Stooges slipping on a banana peel humor. And in Season 1 and parts of Season 2, these different elements, they were somewhat kept in a good balance with each other. Latter parts of Season 2, the slapstick humor and absurdist humor, it's hard to overstate just how much these elements completely took over the show, to the point where 70 to 80% of a given episode was these horrible comedic subplots. Earlier parts of Twin Peaks, you could say it was a parody, a smart satire. Latter parts of Twin Peaks, it was a full-blown farce. Now let's talk about the horror aspect of Twin Peaks a bit, and what I think Lynchian horror, the director David Lynch, how is his horror different than Lovecraftian horror, any other kind of horror? Now his horror is very dependent on us not being able to explain what is happening using traditional terms, traditional language. The situations we see and the horror we see are normal notions and concepts and words. They fail us, and that's part of what makes it so unsettling. And there's a philosophical basis for this. Jacques Lacan, a very famous philosopher, he talked about 3 different realms, and one of these realms was the symbolic. This is where we're able to use words and systems and language to organize and understand reality. But then there was the real, and this is what reality is actually like. And when we get a glimpse of the real, beyond what our symbolism and our words are able to describe, when we actually see this swirling, howling void, this alien, ununderstandable mass of reality, when we see this, it's quite shocking and quite horrifying to witness. And with Lynch, in these nightmare scenarios, yes, there is aesthetics, and yes, there is symbolism, but fundamentally, it's this kind of nonsense, and it's this kind of inability to make sense of what's happening around you that I think is the true defining characteristics of his unique brand of horror. However, I do think you can talk about Lynch's view of the world, his view of the fundamental nature of reality, or at least what he depicts in his art. In his world, there is good and evil. And this is actually an important theme, that it goes beyond, there's just selfishness and greed and just people being kind of shitty, and there's a spectrum of behavior from kind of good to kind of bad, and everyone kind of falls in that. No, he says there's evil, dark, unexplainable evil that has to be fought and defeated, and then there's good, and there's the forces of light. And this dualistic view is somewhat unique. Most people seem to be atheist and nihilistic about the world and say, look, the biggest evil is that there is no good and evil, and we're just people, and everything's kind of random, and nothing really matters. So people who realize that, they're able to do whatever they want, and that kind of creates evil. But Lynch says, no, look, there's some deeper fundamental realm of existence that's mediated by symbols and a kind of dream logic. And within this deep fundamental existence, there is good and there is evil. There's these opposing forces. And it's interesting how a theme throughout Lynch's work seems to be pairing this kind of old-timey 1950s Americana, the diner with the cherry pie, just a sense of innocence, with the abusive relationships and the drug use and the hypersexuality among teens and all this darkness, and how he seems to link these two things together and show that just how in the spirit world it's evil and good and these fundamental forces linked together and fighting it out. And in any suburb or any small town, there's the goodness and there's the Dale Coopers of the world and there's the coffee and the simple pleasures. And then there's this seedy underbelly of darkness. Now, if you want to understand the humor of Lynch, there's a kind of meta humor constantly drawing attention to the fact that you're watching a TV show, like there's a show within a show and you'll be watching something that occurs on the show that the characters are watching, then suddenly happens to the characters themselves. And then there's a kind of camp humor. Part of that is the characters, the way they interact with each other. It's just over the top and this kind of old school way of talking, using a lot of big fancy words and just all the dialogue's very quotable back and forth. It's not to the extent of like Shakespeare, but it's kind of old-timey, old English. One of the characters, actually Lynch himself, is flirting with the waitress and he says, "I'd like to engage you with an anecdote of no small amusement." Just over-the-top dialogue like that, very quotable. And then right in the first episode, a character says, "Hey, something's up." And the other character is like, what? And looks up. Again, it's just that over-the-top kind of performance and exuberance. And then there's the kind of absurdism humor, the random humor. There's things just make no logical sense. Right from the start of the show, one of the classic iconic scenes, someone brings a character's coffee and then he says, "Oh, sorry, let me take that back. I put a fish in the percolator." Makes no kind of logical sense. Two of the detectives who are investigating this grisly murder, they're talking about a very serious subject and one of them grabs the other's nose. Again, there's no logical explanation for that. It's just that kind of, what did I just see humor. And last thing I'll talk about, as you're watching Twin Peaks, more than almost any other show, you can start to get the sense that you're being trolled. And the whole show is a big joke on you, on the network, on everybody, on the actors involved. So one example, in the second season, a character comes on the show and he's hard of hearing and he starts yelling. Now, this is actually David Lynch is playing the actor, but that's neither here nor there. So a character comes on the show and he just yells. And it's very annoying. It's not funny. It's not particularly insightful or clever. It's just a very unpleasant thing to watch. So you watch it and the episode ends and you're like, wow, that was a crappy little part that they threw in there, but glad we'll never see him again. And then he comes back episode after episode after episode and continues to yell at you until the point you can't take it anymore. Then he goes away for an episode and you think, thank God, this horrible, bad running joke that nobody likes, like nobody in the audience is calling for him to return. And you think, thank God he's finally gone. But then he comes back the following episode and bringing him away, that was just, again, part of the joke on you to make you finally breathe a sigh of relief and think he's gone. Anyways, the show, mercifully, eventually this guy drives away enough viewers where the show gets canceled. After 2 seasons, the show goes away for a while, it's going to come back, everyone gets excited for its return. So what happens, they bring back that same guy, David Lynch, yelling at you, and he is one of the 2 biggest protagonists on the new season. If you thought he was on the show a lot in season 2 and you hated it, boy, in Twin Peaks Revival, he is constantly there, constantly yelling, and it's just a matter of David Lynch just doubling down on something. If he puts something out there and he gets negative feedback and people don't like it, people think it's uncomfortable, and people want it to change, he just takes that as a sign that he's doing something right and just doubles down and continues to put it out there to the point where you see it so much and you think, wow, if this brilliant director keeps putting this on the screen episode after episode after episode, am I the problem? And am I just not seeing the brilliance of it? Is it actually really funny? And at some point you actually find yourself genuinely, maybe this is kind of funny. But then you switch back and you're like, no, it's horrible. And one more example of them taking a horrible running gag and just running with it, pardon the pun. A character in season 2, she goes into a coma, and when she comes out of the coma, she thinks she's 18 years old. And again, immediately you dislike the storyline. You don't think it's funny, you're not enjoying it, and you're like, please, hopefully in a few episodes, we get out of this and she comes back to normal. That's maybe episode 2, 3, 4 of the start of the second season. They keep this running joke for the entire 18 episode season, and not even a normal size season, 9, 10 episodes, even 15 episodes. No, an 18 episode, 50-minute show, they keep with this horrible running joke about someone who believes she's 18 years old, and then they give her super strength as well, and they build on this joke, and they flesh it out, and they take it in new directions, and it becomes one of the key storylines running through the second season. So I'm going to wrap up the video there. It's getting long. Bottom line, if you want to know what is Twin Peaks' legacy, not the revival, but the first 2 seasons of Twin Peaks, what is Twin Peaks' legacy? You have to say it is a show like no other, and no one can argue it's not a unique show and a special show. It's mix of, like I say, the over-the-top antics of a soap opera with the absurdism and the camp humor and the otherworldly dark elements and surrealism. All these different ingredients, they mix together to make a show that truly is unique, and it truly had a unique vibe and feel that is like no other. Can you say that it's a great show or even a good show? Looking in totality, can you even say it's good as a whole to watch through? I don't think you can even say that. There's long stretches of it that parts work. There's always parts that are funny and parts that are okay, but a lot of it is unwatchable. So comparing it to show Breaking Bad, it's a show everyone talks about being one of the greatest shows ever. Breaking Bad, each episode for the most part is consistently excellent. Each season, of course, is consistently excellent. Can you say that Breaking Bad is truly a unique show that's genre bending and, redefined things that you can do on television? No. So when you compare that, Twin Peaks and Breaking Bad is, I guess, a better show. Twin Peaks is a more special show, a more unique show. And last thing I'm going to do, if you think I'm overstating just how goofy latter Twin Peaks got, I'm going to talk about some of the different storylines that all existed at one time in the Twin Peaks universe. So there will be some mild spoilers. None of these storylines are particularly important, but understand that at a given point in time, we had Nadine, who thinks she's 18 years old, has super strength, and is wrestling and then dating Mike. We had Lucy, Andy, and Richard in this love triangle where Andy's, again, this slapstick comedy with his sperm and porno megs, and then they team up, Richard and Andy, because they think that this little Nicky boy is actually Satan and is murdering people, and then this becomes a love triangle. I don't know, what's a for? Love rectangle? It seems wrong, but whatever. Love rectangle with this new vixen that's come to Twin Peaks where she's moderately more attractive than any other character we've seen, but all the men are just drooling over her. One of the mayor who she's with has a heart attack, so then the mayor's brother is really mad at her. He rushes over to attack her, but is so swept up under her spell, suddenly now they're dating. And eventually she wants to win the beauty pageant, so she goes to Richard and she wants to bribe him because he's the judge of the beauty pageant, so that this is how we get the love rectangle. We have Bobby and Shelley living with comatose Leo, all in this big dysfunctional house, and then Bobby goes to Mr. Horn, who's crazy, and he's doing these Civil War reenactments, and Bobby tries to get a job with him, and then Mr. Horn eventually comes out of it, and he has this new environmental sensibility, and he wants to save the pine weasel, and we get this weird auction to save the pine weasel, but where the weasel breaks free, and we have what can be only described as a weasel cam with a camera from the point of view of the weasel. We had Winsome Earl. Leo eventually kind of wakes up, and then Winsome Earl is torturing him in this cabin with a shock collar, eventually kills a stoner that looks like Justin Long from Idiocracy. We have, what else do we have? We have the transgender or cross-dressing agent, and at one point there's a sting where she pulls the gun out of her crotch. And again, that's not even considered the weird bad part of Twin Peaks. That's considered the very progressive, actually somewhat forward-thinking part of Twin Peaks. We had Pete giving these long, rambling speeches about chess during these chess lessons, not to mention James, who leaves and has probably one of the worst storylines over in another town with this woman who he has an affair with and then frames him for murder. Donna is always horrible. And then the whole storyline with Josie as the maid. And this is not even to talk about the UFOs. The UFOs, that part is the part that makes sense in Twin Peaks. And you gotta feel like Lynch really pulled a Kobe where when he wasn't getting what he wasn't getting to do what he wanted with the show, he said, fine, you're not going to let me do what I want with the show, then I'm going to step away, I'm going to give it to other people, or I'm just going to drive it into the ground. And then I forgot about David Lynch's hard of hearing character yelling at you the whole second season. So all those things I mentioned, those were in a relatively short amount of time, from maybe episode 8 to the final episode, episode 18. That's a lot of nonsense for a show where you want to say it's one of the greatest shows of all time. But nonetheless, I do think Twin Peaks, you can say it's one of the greatest shows of all time. Just understand what you're saying when you say that. If you're going to defend Twin Peaks as being consistently a great show, a show that you want to turn on and watch all the way through a bunch of times, I don't know.